Back in the 1980s, American comics went through a revolution of sorts as comics moved from the newsstands to specialty stores and were able to get out from under the Comics Code. This allowed comics to embrace darker, harsher themes as well as portraying levels of sex and violence that they weren't able to offer before. At this same time, comics entered a new phase of their existence where they stopped simply telling tales of adventure and turned more towards social commentary, reconstruction of its subjects, and more adult content. This movement was led by a wave of British creators, and several of these creators are interviewed in a new film I watched recently called Future Shock, the story of 2000 AD, which is a documentary telling the history of how the 2000 AD comic came to be and how it transformed the British comic scene. 2000 AD would be created in the late 1970s over in England, and as it's described by the creators that were interviewed for this film, the country had a lot of unrest at the time. The economy was in really bad shape. Young people were having trouble finding work. There was a lot of discontent, particularly towards authority. The sort of cultural upheaval that was fueling the rise of punk rock would also lead to Pat Mills, who was working in comics at the time and hated the very safe, saccharine stories he was doing, to create a comic called Action. No, not that one. Action was influenced by the action films and thrillers that were popular in cinema at the time, like Dirty Harry and Death Wish. It portrayed fairly violent stories with a contemporary setting, which were really pushing the envelope of the level of violence that you could depict. And a lot of the stories were very counterculture and attacking the establishment and authority and that sort of thing. They did an issue with a cover where it looks like a young man armed with a chain of some kind is attacking a policeman, and that led to Action being banned by the government. As a result, Mills and his fellow creators would go on to create 2000 AD, which allowed them to create stories that covered similar themes, but they could do it under the cover of science fiction and allegory, and thus avoid some of the criticism that they received when doing stories that had a contemporary setting. It's interesting that Mills speaks of 2000 AD as being a retreat. It really bothered him that they had to hide behind sci-fi in order to tell the kind of stories they wanted to tell. Also, according to the film, Mills' principal influences were not American comics, particularly superheroes. Apparently, he didn't like superheroes very much. His influences were more towards French comics and magazines. In particular, the French magazine Metal Hurlant was something that he looked to as a model to follow. Eventually, an English language version would be published called Heavy Metal that would make its way to America. Not surprisingly, the creators who worked on 2000 AD received a great deal of resistance and resentment from the established comic industry, who saw them as a threat, I suppose, and didn't like how they were changing the comic book business and pushing the envelope of what you could do in various ways. Over the years, a number of popular characters would be introduced in the pages of 2000 AD, some of which have found an audience here in the States. And none were more popular than, of course, Judge Dredd, everyone's favorite judge, jury, and executioner. And one of the big surprises in the film, it's revealed that Mills, when he first conceived of the character around 1977, had the idea that Dredd was going to be an occult detective who would specialize in supernatural cases. Writer John Wagner, who co created the character, felt that the concept didn't quite work and suggested the idea that his character was a judge, and artist Carlos Esquivel created Dredd's look and the dystopian future of Mega City 1. Dredd was a good example of the satirical quality they were bringing to a lot of their stories, criticizing the establishment, but mocking it in a very subtle way. And along the way, they also talk about some of the other characters that were popular in the pages of 2000 AD, such as Strontium Dog, Rogue Trooper, and Zenith, among others. Not surprisingly, much like the American comic business, the British comic book industry didn't treat its creators very well, and made it clear in various ways that they didn't place much value on the work that they were doing. In particular, they talk about how original art was not regarded as having much value, and after turning in their artwork, the artists would never get to see it again, and the publishers would treat the art with very little care, using it to mop up spills and even stuffing it into the bottoms of doors to block drafts and that sort of thing. Apparently, British comic book publishers didn't have credits in their comics the way American comics did. The publishers didn't want the public to know who specifically was making the comics, and this was another way that 2000 AD changed the industry as they started putting credits similar to American comics at the beginning of their stories. Now, speaking of American comics, they do talk about how DC Comics began to recruit British talent. In 1981, Dick Giordano and Joe Landa of DC Comics came to London and invited British artists to meet with them and probably get an offer for work. Brian Boland and Dave Gibbons were the first who ever went over to the US and began working at DC, and they talk about how the Brits were able to bring a new perspective regarding American superheroes. They talk about how, yes, many Brits grew up reading Superman, Batman, the Justice League, and all that, but because they were from another country and another culture, they also could cast a more critical eye on them in some ways and question some things that American comic fans just accepted as rote. And by 1986, Dave Gibbons and Alan Moore were doing Watchmen, and at the same time, Frank Miller was doing The Dark Knight Returns, and the two of them just hit tremendously big at the same time and really took the industry in a new direction from that point on. They also interview Karen Berger, who was the editor at DC who got the Vertigo line up and going and turned it into a separate imprint. She made numerous trips to the UK for several years, recruiting new talent such as Grant Morrison, Garth Ennis, Neil Gaiman, and many others. In a sense, 2000 AD became a victim of its own success, as once this trickle of talent from Britain and from 2000 AD in particular over to the States began, it started to grow, eventually becoming a steady stream. And once someone on the book began getting noticed for their work, it wasn't long before DC would come calling and make them an offer, and then they'd be gone. And Mills and others working on the book realized this was really bad news for them, as it would make it impossible for them to retain talent since they just couldn't match what DC was offering in terms of salary, notoriety, and prestige, as well as offering the chance to work on iconic characters like Superman, Batman, and many others. They go on to mention how in the 90s the book really began to struggle, in part due to the erosion of talent, and it was really lagging in terms of sales. David Bishop, who edited the book for much of this period, mentions how he thinks that the Judge Dredd movie that Sylvester Stallone did may have actually saved the book. After it came out, it reignited an interest in the character, and that led to a boost in sales and likely saved the book from cancellation. Although they also mention how this production company called Fleetway Film and TV acquired the rights to many 2000 AD characters to option them for film and TV, and the company was very underhanded and heavy-handed in how it dealt with the creators, demanding they surrender all rights to the characters in terms of visual representations and that sort of thing. During the 90s, another publishing company called Egmont purchased 2000 AD, and by the year 2000, it had been bought again by another company called Rebellion. And during this period, the quality of the work began to improve, and sales improved as well, giving the comic a new lease on life, and it's actually still going even now. Toward the end, they talk about how 2000 AD has influenced popular culture beyond comics, particularly in terms of films such as Robocop, which is clearly inspired by Judge Dredd, or 28 Days Later, or The Book of Eli, and other dark, gritty sci fi films. So ultimately, the conclusion is, and I think it's a correct one, that 2000 AD and the people who helped create it and popularize it really invented modern comics, for better or worse, and put comics on the road that brought them to where they are now, which isn't a good place, admittedly. But I don't know that you can fault them for that. I don't think that they could see what was coming 35 years later down the road. They didn't even think the book would make it to the year 2000 back in 1977 when they started. Anyway, if you're a comic book fan and you have Amazon Prime, I would highly recommend you watching Future Shock. It's really interesting. I really like the glimpse it gives of the British comic scene before 2000 AD came along and the early years of the book. The stuff from when DC starts getting involved, I mostly knew already, but not all the details, just kind of the broad strokes. But I think it's very much worth watching, and I recommend that you check it out. If you do, let me know what you thought of Future Shock in the comments. And before you go, please do like this video and sub to the channel and check out some of my other videos while you're here. And I will see you all next time. Thanks for watching.